Back when the UFC had almost no rules, one man stepped into the cage looking like he wanted to end the entire room. Ken Shamrock was not just another tough guy in a young sport full of tough guys. He was the fighter people talked about differently. He had the stare, the neck, the traps, the wrestling base, the submission danger, and that lion's den energy that made every matchup feel like a survival test. Most new fans know the older version. They know the Tito Ortiz rivalry. They know the losses, the comeback attempts, the clips that get passed around without context. But that is not the version that made fighters nervous in the 1990s. Prime Ken Shamrock was a different beast. To understand why, you have to go back before the UFC became polished, before weight classes were normal, before every prospect grew up drilling striking, wrestling and jiu-jitsu in the same gym. In the early 90s, MMA was still a laboratory. Nobody fully knew which style would survive. Boxers showed up with one glove. Karate guys showed up with point fighting habits. Wrestlers showed up with pressure. Jiu-jitsu showed up with the answer nobody saw coming. And then there was Ken Shamrock, a shoot fighter with pro wrestling charisma, catch wrestling attacks, real grappling instincts, and a body built for damage. Before the Lion's Den, before the Superfight belt, before the UFC made him one of its first recognizable stars, Shamrock had already lived a hard life. He came from a chaotic childhood, bounced through trouble, and found combat sports as a way to turn anger into identity. Pro wrestling gave him performance. Japan gave him legitimacy. Pancrase gave him danger. That Pancrase chapter matters because it shaped the version of Shamrock that entered early UFC. In Japan, he was not just acting like a fighter. He was learning how to win real hybrid fights, where submissions could end everything in seconds and where the line between sport, pain, and pride felt very thin. He built a catch wrestling game that attacked legs, necks, and balance. He learned how to make strength technical. He learned how to make pressure exhausting. That is why the Lion's Den became more than a gym name. It became a warning label. The stories around that camp were brutal. The workouts were not designed to make you comfortable. They were designed to find the place where you wanted to quit, then make you stay there. Fighters who came through that environment talked about it like a filter. If you could not handle the pace, the contact, the grind, and the mental pressure, you did not last. There was also a presentation quality that separated him from almost everyone around him. Shamrock carried himself like a star before the sport fully understood what a star was. He did not need much polish. He had the walk, the glare, the controlled anger, and the sense that something bad was about to happen as soon as the door closed. That mattered because early UFC was selling uncertainty. Fans did not know which styles worked yet. They did not know whether a wrestler, a striker, a karate fighter, or a submission specialist would control the future. Shamrock made that uncertainty feel physical. He looked like the kind of fighter who could punish a mistake from any range. So when people talk about his aura, it was not just bodybuilding and attitude. It was the combination of danger and credibility. He looked scary, but he also had enough real grappling to make that look mean something. That is the context people miss when they watch old footage and laugh at how raw the sport looks. The technique is not modern. The gloves are different. The camera work is different. The commentary is different. But the threat was real. Shamrock was not playing a character. He was becoming one of the first complete threats the UFC audience had seen. Then came the Royce Gracie problem. At UFC 1, Royce shocked almost everyone because he made bigger fighters look helpless. But Shamrock was different from the others. He understood grappling danger. He was not just some striker being dragged into alien territory. He was supposed to be one of the men who could meet Royce in that world. And Royce still caught him. That loss is part of the Shamrock story, but it did not make him look harmless. It made the rivalry bigger. It made the rematch feel dangerous because fans could ask a real question. What happens if Ken gets another chance and understands the trap this time? That question helped create the early UFC Superfight era. At UFC 5, Shamrock and Royce went 36 minutes. By modern standards, it is a strange fight, long, grinding, cautious, and very different from the highlight reel pace people expect now. But historically, it mattered. It showed that Shamrock could survive deep water against the man who had changed the sport. It showed cardio. It showed stubbornness. It showed that Ken was not just an explosive bully. He could hold position, suffer, adjust, and refuse to disappear. That is one of the keys to prime Shamrock. He was scary before the fight, but he was also hard to break inside it. Now look at UFC 6 against Dan Severn. Severn was a massive wrestling problem. He was strong, experienced, and built to smother people. For a lot of fighters, that matchup would have been a slow drowning. Shamrock turned it into a legacy moment. He caught Severn and became the first UFC Superfight champion. That image matters because it captures the original Shamrock threat. He was not only a wrestler. He was not only a submission guy. He was a pressure fighter who could make a strong man defend everywhere at once. If you stood with him, he could crash into you. If you went to the ground, he could attack your legs or neck. If you gave him a scramble, he could turn it into a trap. And if you looked across the cage before the bell, you had to deal with the stare. This sounds simple, but in early MMA, presence mattered. Shamrock looked like he believed violence was his job. He did not bounce around trying to look loose. He looked locked in. Fighters have talked for decades about the difference between confidence and menace. Shamrock had menace. He made the walk feel like part of the fight. Technically, his game was built on control and explosion. His wrestling gave him the base. His hips and upper body strength let him force positions that did not look clean but felt impossible to escape. His catch wrestling background made him dangerous in transitions. He did not need a beautiful modern sequence to threaten you. He needed a limb, a neck, or a moment where your balance broke. That is why old-school Shamrock is easy to underrate and hard to compare. A modern fighter has better striking defense, better cagecraft, more complete drilling, and cleaner round-by-round strategy. No serious person should pretend 1996 MMA technique is the same as 2026 MMA technique. But that is not the interesting question. The interesting question is, what happens if you put prime Shamrock's mentality, athleticism, and grappling instincts into a modern training room from age 20? That version is a problem. Because the raw ingredients were elite for the era. He had strength. He had explosiveness. He had pain tolerance. He had submission aggression. He had real charisma. And most importantly, he had the kind of competitive anger that makes fighters keep coming forward even when the plan starts falling apart. That anger is also why the later Tito-Ortiz rivalry hit so hard. By the time Tito became the young champion, Shamrock was already the legend. Tito knew how to sell a fight. He mocked the Lion's Den, called Ken old, and turned the generational tension into must-watch television. UFC 40 felt huge because it was not just a fight. It was the old dangerous era standing across from the newer, louder, trash-talking era. Age caught up with Shamrock. That is the part people remember because it is easy to clip. But the rivalry worked because the audience understood who Ken had been. Tito was not disrespecting a random veteran. He was poking the man who helped build the cage he was standing in. That is why judging Shamrock only by the end of his career is lazy. Every fighter who stays too long pays attacks. Reflexes slow down. Damage builds. The body stops responding on time. Fans who arrive late see the decline and assume that was the whole story. But with Shamrock, the prime is the point. He was one of the early fighters who made MMA feel dangerous, marketable, and personal all at once. He had the look for posters. He had the voice for interviews. He had the training camp mythology. He had real wins and real rivalries. He had enough technical danger to matter and enough charisma to make people care. Was he the most feared fighter of his generation? There is a strong case. Royce Gracie was the most revolutionary. Dan Severn was one of the most imposing wrestlers. Tank Abbott had raw chaos. Bas Rutten had elite violence and personality. But Shamrock sat in a unique lane. He combined fear, legitimacy and mainstream presence before the sport really knew how to manufacture stars. That is why Prime Ken Shamrock still works as a story. He was not perfect. He was not unbeatable. He was not a modern fighter dropped into the past. He was something rougher and maybe more important, a bridge between spectacle and sport. He made casual fans stop scrolling. He made fighters prepare for submissions. He made rivalries feel personal. He made the Lion's Den sound like a place you had to survive, not just visit. So when people ask whether Prime Shamrock could compete with today's UFC stars, the honest answer is complicated. If you time machine him straight from the 90s into a modern cage, modern fighters have too many layers. But if you give that same athlete modern coaching, nutrition, sparring structure and recovery, the conversation changes. The mentality travels. The wrestling travels. The ability to scare another trained fighter before contact even happens travels. And that is the hot take. Prime Shamrock's biggest weapon was not one submission or one slam. It was the feeling that the fight was going to be ugly no matter what you wanted. That is what made him terrifying. That is what the old clips still show. And that is why, decades later, Ken Shamrock is still one of the names you cannot leave out when you tell the story of how MMA became real. Drop a comment. Could 1996 Ken Shamrock survive in today's UFC with modern training, or was he built only for the chaos era? If you want more old-school legends like Royce Gracie, Tank Abbott, V.A.S. Rutten or Wanderlei Silva, subscribe and turn on notifications. Stay savage.